Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest European Parliamentary Research Service roundtable. I'm Anthony Teasdale from the EPRS, and today we're going to be discussing this publication. It's a report which has been done by the Darendorf Programme at St Antony's College at Oxford University, and it's about youth opinion towards and in the European Union today, what people expect of the European Union, want of the European Union, how they think about the European Union. It's called Young Europeans Speak to EU, to You. It's in fact the first of two events which we'll be holding. The second we'll be doing jointly with DG Communication early next year, looking at broadly attitudes among young people towards Europe and the responses of the European Union to those hopes and expectations. And today we're particularly privileged to be joined by Professor Timothy Garton Ash. Timothy is, as many of you I'm sure know, one of the world's leading public intellectuals, not least on Europe, on European history, European society, about the notion of Europe itself. He's Professor of European Studies at Oxford University. He's a Fellow of St Antony's College at Oxford, and he's author inter alia of a slew of books over the years: In Europe's Name, The Uses of Adversity, The Polish Revolution, The Magic Lantern, Facts Are Subversive, and most recently, Free Speech, 10 Principles for an Interconnected World. He's also a winner of the Charlemagne Prize. I think he's the first person that we've had at an EPRS event who has won the Charlemagne Prize, and that's, as you know, a great honour awarded annually for a contribution towards the process of European integration and the understanding of Europe, which really has been his life's work. And he's going to be joined today by two of the postgraduate students that helped him. And in fact, in many ways, they, I think, were the drivers of the analysis and work represented in this report, helped him put together this snapshot, if you like, of young people's contemporary views on Europe. We're joined here by Lucas Tse, one of the report's co-authors, a doctoral researcher in economic and social history at Oxford at All Souls College, and Sophie Véritier, again, co-author of the report, doctoral researcher now at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University and previously at Oxford. And we'll have reactions from Bruce Stokes, who's well known to us in the EPRS context, senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., and former director, more relevant for these particular purposes, former director of global economic attitudes at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., where he coordinated their polling, and Silvia Kotanidis, who's a policy analyst in the Citizens Policy Unit of EPRS and takes a special interest in the issues which we're discussing today. And that discussion will be moderated by Jutta Schulze-Hollmann, who is the Director of Resources in EPRS. And there'll be plenty of opportunity for you, as the audience, we're now 65 online right now, to participate by asking questions or making comments about what you've been hearing. And please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function for that purpose, or any other means that you can find, including the chat, to pose questions. Jutta will pull those questions together, make sure that our panelists are given a proper opportunity to hear your views on this subject, as well as what young Europeans have to say and speak about and to the European Union. So over to you, Timothy.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and great thanks to the EPRS for doing this event. It's a pleasure to be with you in Brussels, if only virtually. I think we could agree that few questions are more important for the future of the European Union than what young Europeans want it to be and to do. And that's a question we spent the last 3 years pursuing here at Oxford with an extraordinary team of actually about 30 young Europeans from all over the continent, not just from the EU, from all over the continent. All of them at the time graduate students at Oxford, and they were absolutely terrific. We used, partly dictated by the fact that it was this extraordinary COVID moment, really 3 main methods. First of all, you can find on our website, europeanmoments.com, and perhaps I think, yes, Cecile has very kindly just put that up in the chat. More than 200 interviews with Europeans across the continent, asking them a set of very simple questions like, what was your formative European moment? What was the worst, best European moment for you? What was the best European moment? What do you want Europe, the most important thing for Europe to do by 2030? And that very simple method was extremely revealing. That was, of course, clearly not a representative sample. So the second method we used was working with the EU Opinions polling project of the Bertelsmann Foundation, representative sample, EU 27 and the UK, 4 waves of polling, asking a series of questions, some of which I think produced very revealing answers, as well as looking at all the existing polling done by Pew, done by Eurobarometer, and so on. And then thirdly, we identified a series of key areas that emerged again and again from those conversations and that polling: freedom of movement, climate change, social policy, democracy, Europe in a changing world, and then dug deeper onto those. So expert seminars, in-depth research, intensive discussions in our own group. And the result is this report, which, though I said it myself, I think is extremely interesting. 2 young European authors to each chapter. The whole report is online, so you can see it online. Each chapter is structured in the following way. The first section tries to summarize what we've learned about what young Europeans want the EU to do and to be. The second chapter looks quite critically at what the EU is actually doing and not doing in this area, looking at those 5 areas. And then the third section of each chapter produces a set of sometimes quite challenging demands to the EU, not, of course, speaking on behalf of all young Europeans, because that's impossible, but very much drawing on this work, but in the name of the specific authors. And that's what we're going to present to you today. Let me emphasize once again, I was the facilitator, the animator, the moderator, the encourager, the critic, but it really is the work of these young Europeans. It's really them speaking directly to the EU. And we have, as you mentioned, Anthony, 2 of the authors to present some of the findings. I should mention that the last chapter of the report is called Synergies and Trade-offs, because it's quite obvious that there are some pretty tough trade-offs to be found between the demands in these different areas. For example, if you want a lot of freedom of movement, but also do something about climate change, what are you going to do about flying around the continent? That's one rather obvious example. Lucas is essentially going to concentrate on the findings on what young Europeans want, and then Sophie is going to present some of the proposals, suggestions, dare we say, demands. So without more ado, let me hand over to Lucas in the first place to present some of the findings.
It's a privilege to be able to share some of our research with you today. And so let me jump straight into some of our findings. As Timothy mentioned, we have a number of chapters, and what we did was try to separate these different themes that concern young Europeans before bringing them back together in the conclusion, which we will touch on as well sometime in the next 10 minutes or so. It might also be good to just mention very briefly that we do have a discussion at the beginning of the report about who young Europeans are before diving into the specific issues. And there's a very simple and a very complex answer to that. The simple answer that we define young Europeans as those aged between 16 and 29, and we follow some of the conventions in demographic research on young, middle, and older age Europeans. On the other hand, when it gets to explaining why young Europeans have the beliefs they do, we do also draw on a more complex set of approaches, and in particular trying to make some suggestions about where there is an age effect, where there's a period effect, and where there might be a cohort effect. And these are all open questions that we try to give our best attempt at answering. So if we now move on to the first theme, which is free movement, the quote from one of our interviewees on the left does sum up a really important finding, that there is a tremendous emphasis placed upon free movement by young Europeans, and indeed all Europeans, as the chart on the right suggests, although it is particularly notable in our research on formative moments that free movement is by a significant margin the most frequently cited formative moment for young Europeans. But it's also really important that we discuss some of the nuances of that research, and in particular, we try to disaggregate some of the country-level perceptions of the benefits and costs of free movement. And there is a range of quite detailed data that we've been able to come up with. But just to give you a sense of the range, for example, we have 45% of French respondents thinking that there are more costs than benefits to free movement for their country, while 28% of Poles surveyed agreed with that statement. Another difference, just to note briefly, and this here there is more of an age effect, is the nature of the external border as it relates to free movement. And we do find that a significantly fewer young Europeans believe in the need for a well-guarded external border. Of course, there is much more to that, and I just want to flag that for further discussion. Now onto climate. So what is not surprising is that climate is very important to young Europeans. However, at least some of us were more surprised that there was no strong generational effect in how urgent climate action is. Young and old Europeans are actually fairly united on that front. What is different is the set of different preferences for what measures to take to tackle climate change. And there, I certainly think some of our detailed findings in that chapter may be of interest in terms of, there's quite a detailed list of different ways in which that might be possible. The question of which actions to take and how to proceed in taking those actions also leads up to this chart on the right, which is quite provocative, and we've spent about a year among ourselves and with different audiences trying to unpack what this chart means, and we can continue doing that a little bit today, in which 53% of young Europeans think that authoritarian states are better equipped than democracy to tackle the climate crisis. And you can see the chart there disaggregates the age profiles of respondents. And I won't do too much in the way of interpreting it because it's something we can discuss, but it does lead us to think that there may be a broader issue here in how young Europeans really value performance legitimacy, possibly in addition to or over procedural concerns of legitimacy. Onto social Europe, which is a theme that we also wanted to focus on. So we also see a strong belief among young Europeans and also Europeans of other age groups in favor of a basic income, 71%, which was to some extent surprising to us. It's quite a high figure for a very ambitious policy. A mandatory minimum wage, which is, I suppose, a less ambitious or at least better tried policy, had 84% in support. But again, just to bring up some of the nuances that began to appear in our research, we saw some suggestive evidence, not conclusive, but suggestive, that there was possibly a split between young and very young Europeans in the salience of social policy compared to environmental concerns. And this is only a hint in our findings, but teenage and early 20s Europeans seem to have less emphasis on social policy than on climate action. And the quote on the left of building an infrastructure to support incomes across member states for those who are in need does bring up the broader questions of redistribution, which are of course very complex. And we, I won't go into this because Sophie will touch on this too, but in terms of recommendations for possible policies at the European level, there are a number of trade-offs to weigh. Now on to democracy. So in our March 2021 polling, we found that a majority of Europeans, 65%, believe that the EU should act more decisively to uphold liberal democratic institutions. The highest response rates were from Germany and Poland, both above 70%. And interestingly, there was no age difference on this question, but there was one in terms of formal education. So 72% of university graduates believed that more decisive action was required, whereas 62% of non-graduates supported this. I just want to bring up this interview, of which there is a very brief excerpt on the left, with the mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski, in which one of the themes for further discussion is how the EU could take decisive action to uphold democratic institutions without punishing European citizens. That was a theme that came across very strongly in this interview, but it was also echoed in a number of other interviews. And this, again, transitions into the recommendations, so I will leave that for Sophie and for further discussion. Okay, on to the last of the finding slide. So this is the final chapter before the conclusion, Europe in the world. And so just as background, unsurprisingly to those who have been paying attention to this area, there is a consistent large majority of young Europeans and Europeans as a whole in favor of a common EU foreign policy. Our research confirms this existing finding in the literature. What is a bit complicated is we also ask young Europeans to rank their priorities and preferences, personal priorities as well as priorities for the EU. And you see that ensuring EU security and defense is quite low on that list. And you know, we ask a cluster of such questions a number of ways, and it's difficult to get around the feeling that foreign policy and geopolitics, as conventionally construed, is not very high on the priority list for young Europeans. On the other hand, you know, almost all of our interviewees and I think the survey respondents would have an intuition that nothing that concerns their everyday life in Europe is devoid of an external dimension. So that leads us to do a bit of soul searching and to ask questions about what story can be told about Europe and the world. And that again transitions out of the findings into the analysis and recommendations. So at that point, I will gladly hand over to Sophie.
Thank you, Lucas. It's a real honor to be here and to speak on behalf of the wonderful team that put together this report. So now moving on to the recommendations on these 5 themes that we cover in the different chapters of the report. First, free movement. As you said, Lucas, it's one of the most important benefits that young Europeans identify when it comes to the European Union. And our team believes that we should therefore capitalize on that by extensively supporting programs that encourage free movement, such as Discover EU, Erasmus+, and the European Solidarity Corps. However, our team also highlights that these programs and free movement more generally in the EU is not benefiting every European equally. So in order to have less inequalities when it comes to freedom of movement, our team suggests to make these programs more inclusive by focusing on less privileged Europeans who can benefit from, for instance, Erasmus+. Also by focusing on bridging East and West with these programs because obviously for reasons of facility of language and history, often destinations that are in the West are privileged, but we should also encourage students to go to the East and to have more connections between these two parts of Europe. And lastly, we believe that freedom of movement should also apply to foreign EU residents, for instance, after a residency of 2 years. When it comes to climate change, of course, young Europeans are tired of the bureaucracy and the vested interests that prevent urgent climate action. So in general terms, our team recommends the European Commission and the Council to actually follow the European Parliament's proposals, which tend to be much closer to what the public actually wants when it comes to climate change. The European Commission and the Council proposals are usually always a little bit lower, a little bit less ambitious. And secondly, more specifically, we recommend to ban short-haul flights, which could be replaced by a train journey of less than 12 hours. This is a policy that actually overwhelming majority of Europeans would support. And we also highlight that this should be in priority implemented for EU officials who travel and have very often business trips across Europe. So it's a little bit ironic that they support climate change while traveling all the time by flight. Next, when it comes to a social Europe, welfare and income security are two key priorities for young Europeans, especially in a post-pandemic context. So we recommend to encourage minimum income schemes for young people, specifically made for young people across EU member states. Currently, there are disparities in such schemes. Sometimes they exist, sometimes they don't exist. So we recommend that such schemes are implemented across the EU. And as well, we recommend gradually ensuring a minimum wage, a common minimum wage across the EU, which ideally should be in the long term something like 50% of the average income in that country. And this is again something that is supported by an overwhelming majority of Europeans, according to our polling. Regarding democracy, what our report highlights is the current crisis of liberal democracy and public trust that is in Europe. However, yes, and so as an illustration of this, and I think it's quite unfortunate that most Europeans think that the presence of the European Parliament is actually secondary to delivering effective action. So there are two topics that are covered in the chapter on democracy, which is the crisis of liberal democracy in specific member states of the EU, and particularly Hungary and Poland, but not only, and then democracy more in the general sense. When it comes to these specific member states, our report recommends taking a clear stance on the erosion of democracy in these member states, and that means stronger statements and potential change in the way the EU supports its member states by directly providing support to local actors such as NGOs and local governments. More generally, we recommend fostering deliberative democracy. Democracy is not anymore just voting every 3 to 4 years. That's not what young Europeans want anymore. They want to engage in democracy in ways that are fun, in ways that speak to you and that are accessible. And finally, one of the specific recommendations we make for fostering the European public sphere and debate around democracy is to give an interrail pass to every EU citizen turning 16, not 18, with the current Discover EU program, which also is cumbersome because it requires an application process, and the pass is only valid for a short period of time, so we recommend getting rid of that. And finally, when it comes to Europe in the changing world, of course, as Lucas highlighted, most Europeans are in favor of a stronger global role for the EU. It has been the case consistently. However, the priorities that young Europeans see for the global role of the EU is not necessarily in security and defense in the traditional sense of the term. So there is an opportunity for European leaders to act on this. And what we recommend is to try to under-promise and over-deliver for a change. And as well, to craft a distinctive strategy as a green civilian power. And there is a lot of opportunities at the moment with the strategic compass being discussed. We believe that this is an opportunity that really should be taken by the EU. Thank you so much. I will now give the floor back to Lucas, who maybe can say a few words about the synergies and trade-offs that he identified.
Thank you, Sophie. I will just spend about a minute or two to wrap up and talk a bit about where the report leaves off. And just to doubly emphasize the emphasis we wanted to put on talking about both synergies and trade-offs to bring these different themes back together, because ultimately we separated them to get some insight into these different aspects, but we want also a sense of the whole picture for young Europeans, but also to bring up some of these maybe difficult conversations about how there will be trade-offs and how important it is to develop those conversations. And I just wanted to very briefly mention 2 points that come up in this final chapter, which full disclosure, I wrote, and on the basis of the evidence and talking, having many hours of conversation with my colleagues and many experts, but ultimately I do take responsibility. The first is how the social and environmental aspects of young Europeans' concerns fit together, and I want to draw on actually the way one interviewee framed it, which is that her desire for the EU by 2030 is to bring together a social and environmental Europe, and I think that really brings up many of these synergies that exist for young Europeans, but also the need to discuss the trade-offs, whether between travel and environmental policies, or between securing jobs and a green transition, even though there are also synergies. The second point that I want to highlight right now is to ask the question of what kind of geopolitical body European institutions want to constitute. And there is certainly some tension here in the sense of young Europeans place a lot of emphasis on Europe as a community of values. But at the same time, as mentioned, they don't place very much emphasis on foreign policy as conventionally construed. And our chapter on European and world even suggests, this might be a bit provocative, that the European Union is the anti-geopolitical actor par excellence. So how are those things supposed to fit together? Does the framing of green civilian superpower capture what young Europeans want? And also, does it kind of contain within it a set of conversations about the trade-offs? And so we leave off this report and develop a final message, which we discuss collaboratively in a colloquium after the 2021 Dorndorf lecture hosted here in Oxford, albeit virtually this year, by Catherine de Vries, who's professor of political science at Bocconi University. And these 3 questions we developed together, which is what should the EU do, what should the EU be, and how should the EU speak and listen? And we try to distill our findings on those 3 questions. But I also wanted to say at the very end that those 3 questions probably will outlive what we have to say about them, but I think they were important ways to help us hone what we had to deliver as a message.
From Anthony and myself, I'm Jutta Schulze-Hömm, I'm the resource director in EPRS, and it's great pleasure to listening to the entire team. So thanks to Professor Garton Ash, to Lucas Tse, and to Sophie Véritier. I hope I pronounced your names more or less correctly. It's yeah, really a tremendous work that you put on the table here, and of course extremely exciting for all of us to listen to the concrete recommendations which you present, that you pulled it all together and you have some, you know, very tangible results to present to us. And I would say this comes in extremely timely at a time which is particularly volatile, I would say, and marked by some challenges that seem to very obviously affect different generations differently. And I don't mention the C word. Before giving the floor to Bruce Stokes, and first of all introducing him, I just would like to clarify, not everyone might have had a look at the chat. We had a pertinent question from the audience already precisely on your recommendations, and Mr. Garton Ash clarified. So those are recommendations from the authors, I assume from a larger group of authors, based, of course, on the findings of both the interviews you held and the surveys. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I think you held 200 interviews, and then you combined this with a larger set of opinion polling. That was just clarified in writing. Not everyone might have read this in the chat. I also have already a question to Lucas Tse, but I would kindly ask for a little bit of patience. We take questions later. We now hear from a very, very experienced pollster, Bruce Stokes, a regular guest in our event. So fantastic that you're available to us again. I see you still have daylight, of course, which is not the case here in Strasbourg. You have been briefly introduced by Anthony, but Anthony will forgive me. I see a lot of people joined since that moment. So I repeat, you are currently the Executive Director of the Transatlantic Task Force of the German Marshall Fund, and you have previously been the Director of Global Economic Attitudes at the Pew Research Institute, Pew Research Center, in Washington, D.C. You're a former international economics columnist for the National Journal, senior fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. You studied at the Georgetown University, Johns Hopkins University, and the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, New York. And you will tell the audience whatever I omitted. We're very excited, Bruce, to hear from you. What are the most remarkable findings of this works from your experience? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jutta, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. This is going to be a great conversation, I'm sure. It's already begun very nicely. I'd like to start actually by thanking Timothy for helping orchestrate all of this, and specifically to Lucas and Sophie for an excellent report. You know, as someone who spent a decade of my life conceptualizing surveys, thinking up the questions, trying to analyze the results, this is a really first-class job. And I'm actually a little bit envious, because you asked some questions I wish we had asked at Pew. And you supplemented those with interviews, which I think, because my initial part of my life was a generation, actually quarter century, was as a journalist, it's those interviews that really flesh out the details of the data. And I know that under the pressures of polling work, we often didn't do that. So I think that you're to be commended. And there's just a rich body of data here and insights that I think all the viewers should try to go to and look at and ponder, really, because you know, as Napoleon is reputed to have said, you know, tell me what was happening in a person's life when they're in their 20s, and I'll tell you what their worldview is. And I think that for people like Timothy or myself, whose worldview was formed during the Cold War, we will probably always carry with us certain prejudices, certain insights, certain ways of looking at the world, which are totally different from your generations. People who came of age after the fall of the wall, after the end of the Cold War, and that's who you are, and that's who the world will be in the future. And so it's terribly important that we better understand that. I would like to just share with you a few insights from some other polls and work I've done that I think complements what you have said. Pew recently did a survey, and they found that young Europeans are more supportive of the European Union than their elders by significant margins. 18 percentage points in Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany. And interestingly enough, given that Timothy and Anthony are on the call, by 22 percentage points in the UK, when the UK is no longer even a member of the European Union. So clearly, as we know from the results of the Brexit vote, if young people were to determine this, the UK would have never left, obviously. And when you dig into that data, you find that these views of the EU, as I think probably you found too, are really determined in part by level of education, as you mentioned. Better educated young people are more likely to be supportive of the EU, but also people who self-identify as being on the left of the political spectrum, which I think, again, is not surprising, given what we know about the views of young people about a variety of progressive issues. Finally, I want to mention, though, a cautionary note that I think relates to a possible future threat to these views of the EU. And it may undermine some of these positive views. UNICEF has just recently released a survey we may have seen, some of the viewers may have seen. And in France, the UK, and Spain, a majority of young people ages 15 to 24 thought that children today would be worse off economically than their parents. And this comports with what we at Pew found periodically when we asked more or less the same question, that young people actually did not think that they would necessarily be better off than their elders. And that's about delivery, right? I mean, if in fact the world itself, but the EU in particular, does not deliver a better economic outcome, when, at least in the post-war period, the implicit assumption has always been children will be better off than their parents. I think that we have to worry about the implications of that for not only the EU, but more broadly, those questions you ask about democracy and whether democracy can deliver. In fact, I would say one of the most disturbing findings in your survey was that survey that young people said that autocracy may be a better way to deliver on climate change in particular, but I think more broadly. And I can say from the U.S. point of view, we just had a survey in the U.S. where 63% of Americans said that Joe Biden had done nothing as president. We have 4.6% unemployment. We have 200 million people have gotten vaccinations. We have this just today was announced the lowest jobless claims in a month in 50 years. And the fact that people live in information bubbles and what happens outside that bubble, they're not aware of and they don't know about and they don't care about. I think this is going to be one of the challenges, that even if the EU delivers on the economy or delivers on climate change, as these information bubbles, this tribalism, this partisanship grows in an information space, it may be irrelevant to people. And I think one of the premises that many of us share, certainly I do, is that democracy will win over autocracy if democracy can deliver. But if the publics don't know that the democracy is delivering, or somehow are unaware of that, or don't want to believe it because the other party delivered it, then I think we're in a very different world. Finally, I just want to share with you, I just recently completed 40 interviews with 40 young parliamentarians in Europe under the age of 40. These are both national parliamentarians and EU members of the EU Parliament. And what was interesting to me was that climate change was one of their major concerns, just as it was in your survey. So they reflect the priorities of their younger voters and their own age group. And I think one of the questions will be whether those young parliamentarians and your young people you polled, how they judge Glasgow and the outcome of Glasgow. It was very interesting. I did these surveys in the wake of the Afghanistan fiasco from the United States. And I had a number of parliamentarians say to me, young parliamentarians, we really don't care what happened in Kabul, but we do care about what happens in Glasgow. And we'll just have to see how that outcome is determined and what it means. The surveys that have been done by Pew, I know, confirm what you found, which is people expect the EU to lead on climate change. But I thought it was interesting in your survey findings and very useful, the low willingness of people to pay more to deal with climate change. I guess I would have anticipated a higher willingness to do that, simply because young people tend to be, I think, less worried about taxes than older people, at least in other surveys I've seen. And so I would have thought that there would be greater support for paying more for climate change, simply because they would assume somebody else was paying the bill. And the fact that they did not support paying more, I think, is again a worrisome sign about their commitment to what needs to be done to deal with climate change. And finally, what was interesting, and I'd be curious to get in our discussion more from you on how young people in your surveys, if it came up even, how to deal with China. We know that in general, Europeans are even more concerned about human rights issues with regard to China than even the Americans are, and that there's a growing anti-Chinese sentiment across the board in Europe. But what Europe is willing to do about that, where the support lies to do something about that. Is there a willingness to work with the United States on that issue? Which there was certainly a strong support among young parliamentarians that I talked to work on China-related issues. But the question is that possible given the economic interests Europe has with China, and given the distance Europe is from China in the national security issues, the military policy issues, Taiwan, for example, it's limited what Europe could do anyway. In summary, it just seems to me that it'll be interesting to see in this discussion where there can be greater activism in Europe on some of these issues, but through the EU. But I would be also very curious about what you think your respondents felt about working with others on these issues. In other words, is there support for the kind of transatlantic cooperation, which frankly was lacking over the last 4 years, but certainly some hope. People of an older generation like myself, and I think Timothy, understand is necessary if we were to tackle some of these issues together. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for your very inspiring reflections, which will take the discussion further. But before we go into the questions that start to come in, I'd like to give the floor to my dear colleague, Silvia Kotanidis. Silvia is a policy analyst. She has a legal background and works in our Citizens Policies Unit. She's specialized on EU institutional affairs, holds a master from King's College London, an LLM in international taxation, and a PhD in European taxation, a topic that, as far as I could see, wasn't covered in the very impressive oeuvre on Young Europeans Speak to the EU. Silvia, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jutta. The first thing that I want to say is chapeau to you guys for this very nice piece of work. I have read some parts of it, and I found it very, actually, very interesting, very warmly written also. So there was an element of a personal engagement. I could feel that, and also very insightful. In fact, what I liked very much was this idea of trying to isolate and trying to find what is the defining element of a whole generation. So you talk about cohort, so about slices of young population, European young population, and you try to isolate and to see what is the drives, what is the defining moment, what is that this generation will remember. Of course, as Bruce said before, each of us has its own defining moment. For the previous generation was, for example, the fall of the Berlin Wall, previously also the Second World War. What is the defining moment of this generation? In fact, I understand that you do not really find it yet. You find a defining, so to say, formative experience, which is the free movement, which in your opinion defines this generation. And that I find very interesting. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say that your study has invited me to reflect on some of my thoughts, on some of my information, or say ideas that I had formed myself through reading of literature and other surveys. And I thank you for that, because in fact I can also explain some gaps that I had, or some question marks that I had, and I will come to that. So I will try to organize a bit my few thoughts into three threads. Something on policy, something on values, and something on the engagement of young people. So on the policy aspect, indeed I see that basically there is environmental, so climate change and environmental issues that are at the center of the interest for young people, social justice, and free movement. So there is this triad that was rightly captured by Bruce in terms of trade-offs between environmental aspects and climate change and social policy. This is in fact not really super new, I would say, because there are also other surveys that confirm that. I also can imagine to mention also what is now going on with the Conference on the Future of Europe. So the contributions that citizens post on different policy areas. So climate is the second most, so to say, interesting topic for citizens, and also for young people. I find it interesting when you talk about the cohort effect or the period effect. So is that climate a cohort effect, or is that something that affects only a slice of the population, or is that something that affects everyone independently from the age? Personally, I think it's a period effect, and I think you also in your publication you almost allude to that. If I think, for example, that any person now that wants to buy a car might think, shall I buy an electric car? Shall I not buy an electric car? So not only young people are affected by this, but for sure for young people, this is very important. What I also noticed is that everything is seen under the prism of free movement, and that is extremely important that you pointed out. Because free movement, in fact, is something that the young generation have been living with. They were born with it. They don't know anything else than that. So they are used to travel around. They don't remember that perhaps some decades ago there were still customs, and there were still you had to show your passport going from one member state to the other. So all this aspect is extremely important that we keep in mind, because I had a feeling, and reading, in fact, your study, I had a feeling, I reached the conclusion that this is the prism under which we have to try to interpret what young Europeans want. And that's why I say that, because when I read, for example, some of the surveys around, particularly the youth survey, I was surprised to see that, for example, migration ranks for younger people, again, the age period that you have identified, ranks 9th only. And also what are, for example, when European young people talk about or say what are their priorities, the solidarity between member states ranks very low. And for me, it was surprising to see that, because in fact, the solidarity is a value that for young people is very important. And through that, through your study, perhaps came to me the idea that, in fact, nowadays, young people, they don't see borders anymore. So they might not see borders. So for them, migration is a fact, is something that happens. They are not so much concerned about, like their fathers, for example. I think in some of your, in your graphs that emerges, that they are less, I would say, afraid that the external borders are permeable than their own fathers. And that I find it very interesting, and it explains to me somehow these other data that I found in other surveys. On the issue of, on the second thread of thoughts that I had on the values, here perhaps I put a stone in the, I throw a stone in the lake. I don't know how the native speakers say that, but I dare say that my impression from having heard also the European Youth Event, from having read some literature on the point, I have the feeling that the young generation now is more egalitarian in values, does not really distinguish, but that perhaps you can confirm, or you can elaborate on that if you wish. They are not so much concerned about gender equality. They are concerned about all type of equality. So for them, there is not this sort of divide, gender equality and protection of minorities, or LGBTIQ. Everything belongs to the broader non-discrimination issue. And that for me was very clear when I heard the discussion of young citizens at the European Youth Event. On another observation on values, again, I fully share what Bruce mentioned before. In fact, I heard about this trend or tendency of young generations also from other sources, but now here I saw it really put it on a graph, and I also jumped on the chair, because in fact young generation now are we say more keen on values, on protection of values of liberal democracy. They're very sensitive on that, and how this really matches with the fact that they consider, or they might consider, that authoritarian governments might be more effective in delivering on climate change. So here I ask myself, is that because the EU is not so much focused on delivering, but is more focused on the process? Is that because the young people are willing to sacrifice a little bit of freedom for having the result? Is that a warning, I would say, even, because those who are young now will be the leaders in European leaders in 10 to 15 years? Is that a warning for us in order to hurry up, in order to really deliver? Because there is the risk that this sort of attraction becomes perhaps in 10 years an infatuation, and who knows, perhaps in 20 years a love story. So I had this thought, and I just put it on the table, and perhaps you can say something on that if you wish. On the last issue then is about the engagement. Here I might slightly perhaps disagree with some of the findings, because I had the feeling that, okay, in terms of engagement, you mentioned that there is little engagement of young citizens. This is sort of true. However, the young citizens, they go to vote. I was also surprised to read that in a recent youth survey, that in fact the young, exactly the slice of age that you mentioned, they went to vote quite numerous. In fact, I think around 65% or 66%. And in some countries, the turnout of young people was even higher than the average national turnout. But it is true that the image of Europe is not fully good, I would say. This contradicts a bit the fact that they say that they go to vote. Of course, no one has checked, but at least in the survey they have gone. They've said that they have gone to vote, and this does not really is not coherent with the fact that they don't have a fully good image of the European Union. This brings me back to the issue of deliveries, of the performance, and they have little understanding of the EU. This is another data that for me is worth considering, because at least more than half of young Europeans, they say they don't really understand, they don't know how the EU functions and so on. So on this, I would conclude that, and it seems to me also what you conclude, that more has to be done by the European Union in terms of engagement with the youngsters, with the young generations, and I fully agree with that. On the Conference on the Future of Europe, I see that you have a very critical opinion on that. In fact, I may agree, there again, I may also disagree, because the representation of young citizens has been quite strong at the at the Conference on the Future of Europe. In fact, they are even almost overrepresented. I find it's a bit too early to say whether it is really a top-down or a bottom-up exercise. It was meant to be a bottom-up. In fact, it has been entrenched with a lot of decision on governance and who does what and who chairs what. But it is true that this process was also necessary because, as you know, the conference is a very complex but also very rich exercise, so it was necessary to establish the rules of the procedure. But young people are very represented, and they also go to the plenary. This does not mean that all what they will propose or all what the citizens' panels propose will be taken up in the final recommendations, but there is a good chance that most of the concerns will be included in that. So I will then wrap up and conclude by saying that I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to reflect on some aspects, and that I would say that we have to pay attention to three things, basically: to the freedom of movement that permeates how the young people see Europe. That is a fact. That we have to pay attention to the efficiency with which the EU works, and also to pay attention on how we involve European citizens into the EU workings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silvia, for adding your very pertinent comments, especially the issue of migration. I found personally also surprising to find amongst others are not more highly ranked, but yes, indeed, we will talk about all this. Before we dive more deeply into the content and the concrete interpretation of one of the other findings, the Conference on the Future of Europe obviously is an issue that comes up here, and I see some questions on how you wish to use this recommendations concretely. So into which kind of ongoing discussions or platforms you wish to feed or hope to feed those recommendations. Maybe it would be useful if you could clarify. This mentioned has been, amongst others, the Year of Youth, which indeed starts in just 5 weeks from now, or any other ongoing discussion.
Let me kick off, and then I'd love to go to Lucas and Sophie on a couple of those points. And first of all, thank you so much for your comments, Sylvia and Bruce. And by the way, Bruce, we actually started with that famous remark by Napoleon, tell me what they were like at 20, which is apocryphal. He never actually said it, like so many famous remarks. Look, on the Conference on the Future of Europe, and we've sent it to the leading people in the conference. We hope that this and other platforms will give our input. But there is a really clear message from this project, which is please don't spend any more time concentrating on the institutional questions on which people in Brussels spend so much time. These are of tertiary, at best, tertiary interest to young Europeans. They are interested in preserving democracy in member states, but the detailed institutional questions, directly elected Commission President or not, are of absolutely tertiary interest to them. And I think Lucas and Sophie will support that. What they are interested in is democracy that delivers. Bruce made this point, and he's absolutely right. So if you ask about the question, 53% think authoritarian states are better equipped to deliver on the climate crisis. We actually dug deeper into that. And it's not like the 1930s, when people were really fascinated by the Soviet Union, and some people were fascinated by the Third Reich, and they actually thought these regimes were fantastic. I've seen the future and it works. It's not like that at all. The people are not fascinated by Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. It's they have deep doubts about the capacity of democracy to deliver, because we have so many checks and balances, so many special interests. They would say such veto power of finance and multinational corporations that they simply doubt we're actually going to get there. So it's doubts about the capacity, I would say in German, the Handlungsfähigkeit von Demokratie. That's, it seems to me, the essence of the point. Performance legitimacy, not procedural legitimacy, to go to Silvia's point. That's what it's all about. And on that, I mean, I think it would be interesting to ask both Lucas and Sophie how disappointed they and their contemporaries are by the COP26 results and what they think on the Conference on the Future of Europe. Perhaps we can put those questions to them. Just one word more on China. Bruce, the next phase of this project is called Europe in a Changing World. And it goes to exactly these questions. We at Oxford are working with EUI in Florence, WZB in Berlin, and universities in India, Russia, the US, Turkey, and China to explore these questions. And we're going to do further rounds of polling on the attitudes to China. But it might be interesting in the meantime to ask that question of Lucas, because Lucas comes from Hong Kong and knows a lot about it.
Thank you, Timothy. So there are many balls in the air right now, which is fantastic. And I just wanted to touch on one point, really, connecting a thread that at least struck me in the comments of Bruce and Silvia that I found very insightful. So if I can take one insight that I got from Silvia's comments above, it's actually quite complicated to understand what the implications are of a lack of a perception of a strong set of borders. It's actually not immediately obvious what follows from that, even though, you know, maybe by now the impression that young Europeans are less concerned about a hard external border. By now, I think many of us kind of have come across that in the research or just by talking to young Europeans. But other implications, I think, need more discussion and more research. And I think hopefully what this report does is push that agenda forward. And I just mentioned two brief ways I think we could go further down this path. One is on this question of solidarity and redistribution, or, you know, also non-economic forms of solidarity, and what the implications are, because the lack of a hard border is by no means, you know, the existence of a strong connection or of solidarity or a positive agenda for redistribution. And just, I think it's an open question of what exactly that means for young Europeans, even if free movement to a certain degree and the lack of a hard border is a common experience or perception, the implications for what connection exists across those spaces is not clear, and I think that needs more discussion and research. And just to add to Timothy's point about the next phase of this project, I think this also might be a way to continue this thread into our next phase of thinking about the global implications of how young Europeans perceive borders or the lack thereof. And in this next phase, we'll be establishing partnerships with universities in parts of the world where there are a very different set of perceptions about borders. And that will not be the entirety of our conversation, but I think that certainly can be one thread to, you know, to develop better self-understanding among young Europeans and young Europeans about what the implications are of this relationship with borders, but also then to really understand the kind of implications that Bruce is talking about on the global stage.
Thank you, Lucas, for adding these few words. Yes, I want to touch upon the remark on this particularly striking results that 53% of young Europeans think autocracy are perhaps better suited to tackle the climate crisis. And of course, as Professor Garton Ash already explained, this doesn't say that young Europeans believe, for instance, China would be better placed at doing that. But I think what it speaks about is the urgency, the sense of urgency that is sensed about this topic, and the bureaucracy, the red tape, and all the different interests and veto powers that prevents the EU from actually delivering in this sphere. So I think it speaks about the urgency of actions, particularly, and indeed also I think what influences this result is the information flows that concerns democracy and authoritarian states. Because I don't think, like was already mentioned, we live in a world here, young Europeans, where all we have known is open borders and democracy. We don't really, I think most of young Europeans don't really realize what it is to live in an authoritarian state. We take all these freedoms for granted. So I think also that influences that perceptions of authoritarian states being more capable. And of course, this information flow and this awareness about what exactly is democracy and what is an authoritarian state is heavily influenced by actors such as China and Russia, who are spreading information, disinformation about this subject. So it's a complicated and complex issue. When it comes to dealing with China and how to deal with others, I thought that it was an interesting question.
Sophie, sorry to interrupt. Before you leave that question, we have also this issue, rather, we have a question from the audience also asking, why did you phrase this question in that particular way? You know, because obviously if you say, could an authoritarian regime better deal with topics X, Y, Z? Right, of course, democracy, of course, has, you know, more layers, of course, is more complex. Of course, you know, a democratic process most likely will require more time. This is inherent in the issue as such. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit upon this before moving on to another issue. Thank you.
Of course. Well, I think we talked about climate change because this was the overwhelmingly most important issue across Europe for young Europeans. So I think that's why we asked that question about climate change specifically. And yes, indeed, it seems like there is, of course, it's not like there is a positive sentiment about authoritarian states, but I feel like the perception that at least they get things done, at least they can deliver very quickly and very effectively, whatever that may be. And so when it comes to urgent crises like the climate crisis or the economic crisis that will follow the pandemic, there is unfortunately a belief that authoritarian states are better placed to tackle these urgent crises. I hope that answers your question. And then I think my second thought was about, yes, how to deal with China and other foreign actors. I don't think that was, or for instance, the US, I don't think that was something that particularly came up during the interviews, perhaps because it was also not one of the focus of our questions, but across all interviews, and I think also in representative samples, in opinion polling, the sentiment is that indeed we want Europe to be a leader, to lead by example, and current events like COP26 are really an opportunity to deliver or not, because this is really a chance for the EU to say, look, democracy can deliver. This is what we come up with when we have multilateral fora. So if we fail to do that with Glasgow, it's another blow to not only the EU, but also democracy and liberal democracy. So I think it's extremely important that they understand the consequences of this, not only for Europe and for climate change, but for the values that represent liberal democracy. And then concerning the points that you mentioned, Silvia, regarding the Conference of Europe and and voting. So I co-authored that chapter, so I have partial responsibility on the harsh criticism on the conference on the future of Europe. First of all, the findings that we base our analysis on is that actually 58% of young Europeans do not vote for the European Parliament. So it's more than it's a majority. It's more than half. So, and what I think this says is that, I mean, it doesn't matter if the percentage, there should be more ways of engaging in democracy, ways that are fun and ways that actually speak to young Europeans, speak the same language. And the conference on the future of Europe, unfortunately, has not been communicated well to young Europeans. And I think that, of course, there is an overwhelming participation of young Europeans because they want to, not because they have been invited to as a normal citizen. I'm pretty sure that if I ask any of my friends in Brussels, I'm originally from Brussels, not in academic circles, not in circles that are focused on Europe, just normal people working in a restaurant, working in a shop, I'm pretty sure they have never heard of this, although they are in the center of Europe. So, I mean, I think to me that speaks volume about how far-reaching that effort has been, unfortunately. So what we suggest is to have events that are really incentivizing young people to participate. Why not presenting this as a festival that travels across Europe? Because that will speak to young people. People want to participate in a festival. People don't want to, young Europeans don't want to participate in a conference on the future of Europe. That doesn't speak to most young Europeans, unfortunately. So I'll stop there so that we can have more questions.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Yeah, and indeed, this sounds like a very, very innovative idea to have a traveling festival. We keep that in mind. Still on the external dimension, I have a question from our director of the ASEAN office in Jakarta, Antoine Ripoll, who says, or asks rather, how do you explain the relative disinterest of young Europeans towards a common EU defense and security policy? Do you believe the risk of conflict is low, or do they prefer to continue to rely on US, NATO for their security? I understand this was not the main focus, obviously, you will follow up, but maybe you can comment on these questions, on this question. Thank you.
On that, but it's pretty difficult to get at a polling answer to that question. Why do you rate that thing so? I mean, try and design the questions to get at that. My hunch is that it is about a relatively low perception of external threat. That would be my hunch. And the way you could test that, of course, is by doing the polling in Ukraine or somewhere where there is a real sense of external threat. And it would be interesting to repeat the polling and see if the answers are somewhat different in the Baltic states and Poland now, given the current crisis on the eastern frontiers of the EU. But that would be my sort of very, very tentative hypothesis. The other thing one would have to look at is sort of elite discourse versus more popular discourse, because of course, as you know, Jutta, in the elite discourse, the question of Europe as a world power, that in a world of giants you have to be a giant yourself, is one of the key new arguments being made for the European project and for the European Union. So that I suspect that may also be another dimension of it. But the honest answer is that we haven't got a clear empirical answer.
I jump in here. First off, a shout out to Antoine. He used to be in Washington, and it's been a long time, and we miss him in DC. But I agree with Timothy. I think, without a visible external threat, it's really hard to get people to focus on this answer, this question, and come up with an answer that is understandable. At Pew, though, we did ask periodically, do you think the United States will come to your defense if a NATO ally is attacked by Russia? And universally, Europeans said yes. We expect and frankly, the Germans in particular were not willing to go to the defense of other NATO allies if they were attacked by Russia. So so I do think part of what the low priority of foreign and especially security policy issues might be for young people is lack of external threat and an entire 70 years of being able to rely on the United States. And so the question, I think, will be, as it becomes more and more apparent to Europeans that America really is pivoting to Asia. I think that while that was first articulated by Obama, it's actually being actuated by Biden. The Trump era was a totally different kind of animal, but in that case, I am sure it will take a long time for it to sink into the average European. But by the same token, I think that we are beginning to see this is what the pivot to Asia looks like, whether it's the focus on China, whether it's the AUKUS incident, whether it's the pull out of Afghanistan. And that will, over time, I think, maybe raise the profile of foreign and security policy to average Europeans, simply because it will become apparent that the relationship with the United States in that realm is different than it was in the Cold War period.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Yeah, and thanks for just jumping in, because I can't see all of you at the same time. So I'm switching back and forth, including to the questions. And indeed, I was supposed to convey congratulations to the whole research team by no one less than Martin Westlake. So I do this now. I who also asked about the conference on the future of Europe, question we already tackled. Going backwards, as regards the presentation, the findings presented by Lucas, there was a very punctured question on the issue of permanent income, where 71%, I think, of young persons replied that there should be assurance of a minimum income. And I have a question from the audience, whether you inquired further how this should be financed. I suppose this is not the case, right? Don't know whether you want to comment on this. Thank you.
As far as I can recall, we asked questions more on the side of what young Europeans would like. And we asked fewer questions about the institutional mechanisms of financing. That said, there are a few findings from the polls as well as the interviews that we do try to interweave into that chapter. So I would, if that's of interest, I would recommend kind of going through our analysis. And of course, we do then kind of try to bridge that analysis with the recommendations. And the authors of that chapter do discuss some of the existing mechanisms at both member state level and European levels, and what the possibilities might be, and how that might fit with what young Europeans have expressed about their minimum wage as well as a basic income. But that is certainly, there's an interpretive move there, and I think there's more research to be done.
Okay.
Can I just add on that, if I may, because we had actually, a fairly expert discussion on UBI and the question of affordability, which is an obvious question. I mean, there were different views on it, but it's interesting that even though there was a lot of sympathy for the idea amongst respondents and indeed our team, if you look at the chapter on social policy, it doesn't simply come out and say we need UBI Europe-wide. It focuses particularly on the question of the minimum wage and a serious minimum wage, so the 50% point that Lucas made. And then there are a number of other specific social policy recommendations, essentially about, I mean, the idea is similar, because the idea is that across the EU, there should be what Ralph Dahrendorf called a common floor. You shouldn't fall below a certain level anywhere in the EU. It shouldn't be the case that that in Germany the common floor is 6 meters above the ground, and in Greece it's 6 foot under, right? So I think that's a much more realistic set of recommendations, but also quite demanding. And I noticed there was a question here, are you in favor of solidarity, large state intervention and redistribution of income? I mean, I think the overwhelming answer, correct me if I'm wrong, Lucas and Sophie, would be yes, actually. I think that is the spirit of the demands.
Thank you very much. I would like to focus on something where I received bilaterally now some comments as well. I personally thought when I saw most of the findings that many issues were not terribly surprising. I hope, despite my age, that I'm relatively well in touch with many people who are considered young according to the categories you defined. However, it seems that in general expectations are very high, and as you said already, you know, that contradictory expectations are seemingly accumulated and just packed together. You know, there's a package of expectations, and obviously, you know, there's contradictions between various of those elements. But at the same time, the level of knowledge seems to be to some extent disappointing of many, you know, so that we have these expectations, but at the same time the level of knowledge is quite worrying. So the issue of civic education comes here maybe as well. I understand you didn't further inquire about that. You took the status quo, and your questions were based on were carried out in a way where, of course, you didn't educate the persons you interviewed for any further, or inquired how their level, what was the, how shall I say, what exactly led to their current level of knowledge, let me put it like this. But what were there findings that you personally found concerning, worrying, because obviously if we have here unrealistic expectations, if we have young people who do not really understand democratic processes, you know, we are at a, you know, at a very shaky ground here, and this would carry some risks, obviously. Thank you for your comments.
Yes, thank you. I think this is something that we address particularly in the chapter on democracy. Yes, expectations are high because the stakes are high. The stakes are extremely high. So we need to expect a lot because a lot is in danger of being compromised here. And when it comes to education, of course, this is key. Awareness is key, and it influences a whole range of issues, not only democracy and a European public sphere, but also, you know, this issue of authoritarian states. And this is particularly important because in today's world, it's extremely easy to get whatever information you want. You go on the web, you go on Google, you get whatever information. You sometimes, well, most of the time actually, you get informed without even wanting to be informed. You are on social media, you receive constant information from all sorts of actors. And many actors have understood that very, very, very well, and have capitalized on that very cheap way of exercising soft power. And the EU, unfortunately, is not very good at this. It's not its strategic communication is quite poor, to be honest. I was also communicating privately with someone in the chat that was agreeing on that, being part of the Commission. There's a huge gap in the way the Commission communicates and the EU communicates as a whole, and the way society communicates nowadays. There's a big gap. So this is something that is extremely important, and that has been raised in some of the interviews we also had one-on-one, that some people believe the EU should make a lot of efforts in communicating better to young people.
If I could jump in here, I mean, who could disagree? I mean, the EU should communicate better with young people. The US government should communicate with better with young people. But behind that, I think, is an assumption that we all make that I think we need to be very wary of. And that is that better knowledge and better understanding will move the world in the direction we want it to go. And I think that, one, that's presumptuous, on the part of all of us. But more importantly, I know when we were at Pew, what struck me most coming out of the journalism world, where, I thought exactly that way. I want to know what people know, and if they don't know it, how do we get them to know it, et cetera, is that people basically operate mostly on emotion and not on reason. And I dare say all of the people on this panel, and probably most of the people watching, value reason over emotion. I mean, public policy should be resolved on reason. And yet I can tell you that after a decade of polling, I was dissuaded from that view. It is depressing at some level for someone like all of us, but by the same token, we have to accept the fact that where people are in life. And as consumers, they go into the marketplace and buy a red car rather than a blue car because they like red rather than blue, even though it's the same car under the hood. And we say, that's great, that's the market mechanism, it'll work. Similarly, people vote on emotion. They don't vote on reason. And while we can hopefully help them get more input, reason input, knowledge input into that emotion, we have to kind of understand their emotions and try to work with their emotions. And I think that's much more difficult, actually. But I think that I know when I was designing questions, and I think some of your questions did that, it's better to design questions in a poll that get at emotion, not at reason. We used to joke at Pew, if you ask people a knowledge question, you'll get an answer, but it'll break your heart, because it will expose the fact that average people don't have much knowledge. But they'll still want the government to act in a certain way. So I think that, I would applaud you for the emotion questions you asked, and kind of say to our listeners, please try to understand that we have to better understand the public's emotion on these issues, and then wrestle with that. And how do we get at that? And Sophie's right. I mean, you want as much soft power communication as humanly possible, but that's about trying to affect people's emotion even more than their reason.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's quite telling that social media, which is where the majority of young people get their news nowadays and their information, favors sensationalist content that actually creates these emotions. And actors such as Russia and China have understood that and capitalized on that very, very well, something that the EU has not done yet. There is potential. For instance, I think it was just yesterday, the European Commission shared this quite telling graph about the impact of vaccination rates and the death toll. I think everyone has seen it. Everyone has shared it. It was wonderful. It was a great data visualization, provoked emotions because it's a topic that I think a lot of people feel strongly about. So I think that it was an example of a very well done job.
Silvia, I felt you wanted to come in, please.
I can only subscribe to what here has been said, although I should perhaps not be so critical on the European institutions, but it is true that they are very bad communicators. Well, very bad. I would say they don't communicate as effectively as they should, especially in some domains that are perhaps politically sensitive, or for example, the issue now of the conference. I make an example. The conference has not been advertised, you are right, enough before. Ideally should have been prepared, should have been I would say anticipated, prepared, and so that you can at least cater for the participation of as many people as possible. On the issue that Bruce mentioned about we don't seek knowledge, but emotions, people vote on emotions, is true. In fact, this is perhaps sadly true, But we have also to, at least I think, we have also to keep in mind that knowledge of Europe doesn't necessarily mean majority is required for a specific policy area, which article falls, the policy falls under which article. It's also, it would be enough to know what is that EU does and what is that member state do. And that, at least that, I think should be expected from, I wouldn't say the average, but at least many citizens. And that is this blurred line between what are competences of the EU and what are competences of member states, I think does not work to the benefit of the EU, in fact. It's always at the disadvantage of the EU and at the image of the EU. So that perhaps is something on which one can think about.
Talking about communication, of course, the Parliament will have to make and is preparing currently a very important communication effort, and that is the one in the context of the next upcoming elections in 2024. And we heard what the turnout of young voters is, and I think that's deeply worrying. I would be very interested, and I'm sure so would be our audience, to hear any suggestions for this the communication linked to the next elections. And I think this is basically kicked off once we have the findings, hopefully concrete ones, of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Many thanks.
Lucas, did you want to say something about your last paragraph? Because I think it's incredibly relevant to that question.
Yes, so just to bring up, to go back to what I'd mentioned about how we tried to end the report. I mean, we actually began in our discussion of how to end the report, we began by the three questions: what should the EU do, what should the EU be, and how should the EU speak? And it was actually only maybe the third or fourth round when we came to this formulation of how should the EU speak and listen, and focusing on the latter part as well. I mean, I just want to echo a lot of the points that have been brought up in the past 10 minutes or so. I think it's not so much piling on more and more information, but trying to use, I think what we've tried to do is more try to use the polling and the interviews to suggest what is currently working and not working in the multi-directional communication that is making up what this report is trying to get at. It's not just top-down laying down the law, but kind of a much more complex ecosystem that we're trying to understand. And in that sense, it's very much not about, oh, we wish people would know more, but trying to understand why it is that certain facts are priorities for people and certain facts are not, and then trying to suggest some of the institutional mechanisms that might lead to more of that alignment between the content as well as the form of that ecosystem, which, I think even in the past 10 minutes, the different panelists have had some really helpful suggestions on.
Can I add just one sentence to that? Because there's one other point that Lucas makes in the conclusion, which I like very much, which is, in the discussion of free speech, the Western, particularly the American, but also West European debate is all about the rights of the speaker and who can speak. In the Indian tradition, it's about the rights of the listener. And there's a great emphasis placed on the listener. And one of the points is made right at the end of the report, I think, to your question, Jutta. The European institutions could do a better job of showing that they're really listening. And I know that's the theory of the Conference on the Future of Europe and the digital platform, but it's not the sense one gets when European institutional leaders speak most of the time. So that maybe there could be a great listening exercise to give citizens a sense that they're being listened to and not just lectured at, because the one thing the EU certainly doesn't do too little of is lecturing people.
Thank you very much, Professor Garton Ash. I'm told that we have to slowly wrap up. I see there's a lot of food for thought. There's clearly A lot of homework to do, not only on communication, but it's clear we do not reach the young generation the way we want. That's absolutely clear. There's a massive gap of knowledge. There's also a disconnect, I would say, clearly, on various platforms. But at the same time, I don't think they're easy remedies. They're easy answers. So, you know, whatever in our and respecting fully the values. Actually, I wanted to ask you, Sophie, about the values as well. We will do this maybe in another context, but fully respecting the system we're operating in, and notably our principle and values. I think there will be only complex answers, but I think we have all reason to be optimistic, and your really tremendous and impressive work will surely be of great help to those who have decision-making power. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for the availability, for the very, very interesting and inspiring talk. And I hand back to Anthony for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jutta, and thank you to everybody in the panel discussion. It's been a really great conversation, and I think the 83 people I think we had at one point online will thoroughly have enjoyed it. They'll have an opportunity to express their appreciation by whatever means shortly. I'd just like to add a remark of my own, if I may, which is that I found the section on democracy extremely interesting, and particularly the pages from about 68 to 72, 73, which are well worth reading to anybody who hasn't done so. And of course, in the middle of that, there is this question about, as long as the EU delivers effective action, the presence or absence of the European Parliament is of secondary importance. Do people agree or disagree? And about 60% basically strongly agreed, somewhat agreed, and 40% either somewhat disagreed or strongly disagreed. This really drew my attention to the issue of causality in political conversation and discussion, because if it's true that for young Europeans making a difference on climate change is critical, they could perhaps be better aware, and it's our responsibility for not doing so, of the fact that the commitment, global commitment in effect now to climate neutrality from 2050 by 2050 didn't really come out of nowhere. I mean, the European Union was the principal advocate of that on the global stage, and within the EU political system, it was the European Parliament that was the principal advocate of Europe making that commitment. And many of the ideas which are to be found in this document in terms of policy recommendations are things in different ways that the European Parliament has been advocating, and many of the achievements which are attributed to Europe are things which the European Parliament has fought for. So for me, one of the principal conclusions is to convince young Europeans of the significance of Europe, and the value of the European Parliament within that process is to tell a story, is to explain how the future might have been different if different choices have been made in the past, and the fact that the European Parliament was behind some of those choices that have shaped the Europe now that people take for granted. For me personally, it's also been a great pleasure that we've been able to do this in association with the Dahrendorf programme, because one of the very first meetings that I ever had the privilege to chair in my entire life was with Ralph Dahrendorf when I was a student at Oxford. I was the chair of something called the Oxford Canes Society, as in John Maynard. I don't think it exists any longer. Maybe that's just the passage of time intellectually and also perhaps student politics. But it was a great privilege to chair him when he was the director of the LSE. And of course, subsequently, he came to St. Antony's and I think was the warden of St. Antony's. And he was the embodiment of a really attractive set of liberal values about the future of Europe, which he had tried in his own life politically to put into effect. Sadly, Ralph Dahrendorf is one of the forgotten makers of Europe, though his standard is still borne high at St. Antony's. And we will be in our next EPRS event looking at the life, the times, and the contribution of another forgotten maker of Europe, namely Robert Triffin, in an event we're doing next Tuesday, the 30th, at 5 p.m., which is an EPRS book talk on From Bretton Woods to the Single Currency, the Intellectual Odyssey of Robert Triffin, Forgotten Architect of the Euro. It's based around a book which has recently been published on Robert Triffin and Life by Ivo Mace and Ilaria Passotti. And among those who will be participating in the panel discussion are Jacques de la Rosière, the former managing director of the IMF, Bernard Snoy, and Professor Susan Howson. So we look forward very much to welcoming as many of you as possible next Tuesday. And we're going to have a further discussion for those of you who are interested in institutional affairs next Thursday, when we have an EPRS book talk with Luc van Middelaar on his new book, Pandemonium Saving Europe, which is about the political dynamics of the crisis which has been engulfing us since the advent of coronavirus. That's on Tuesday the 2nd at lunchtime at 1:30 CET. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been a really fantastic discussion. Thank you for Timothy for not only introducing it, but for bringing together the group of people, among whom Lucas and Sophie have put together this really fabulous report. Thank you to Bruce and to Silvia for your commentary and kind remarks. And thank you to Jutta for moderating the discussion. And I think on behalf of everybody who's been here, and as I say, we had over 80 people participating in the discussion. Apologies to any who asked questions that we couldn't catch, but it was great that there were so many. A really big thank you and great appreciation on our side. Thanks very much, and goodbye, everybody. Have a most enjoyable evening.
Many thanks.